The dark story of England's most controversial mansion, Highclere Castle. A telegram arrives at Highclere Castle in the dead of night, its message coded but urgent. Lord Carnarvon, the 5th Earl, lies dying in a Cairo hospital bed, his body ravaged by blood poisoning. Within hours, he will be dead, just 5 months after opening the tomb of Tutankhamun. As the news spreads through the castle's 300 rooms, servants whisper of the pharaoh's curse. But the real curse of Highclere Castle began long before any Egyptian tomb was opened. It began with sugar, slavery, and the blood money that built these walls. Today, millions know Highclere as Downton Abbey, that PBS fantasy of benevolent aristocracy and loyal servants living in harmony. They see the honey-colored stone glowing in Hampshire sunshine, the 1,000 acres of capability brown parkland, the towers reaching toward heaven like a prayer in sandstone. What they don't see are the invisible foundations, built on colonial exploitation, maintained by an army of forgotten workers, and nearly destroyed by the weight of its own unsustainable grandeur. This is the story of how one of England's most beautiful houses became its most morally compromised, how television saved it from ruin, and why its true history matters more than its fictional one. Chapter 1. The beautiful lie stand at the foot of Highclere Castle on any Tuesday afternoon, and you'll witness a peculiar modern pilgrimage. Tour buses disgorge hundreds of visitors clutching their 20th tour tickets, smartphones ready to capture the exact spot where Matthew Crawley proposed to Lady Mary. They've traveled from Tokyo, Tennessee, and Tasmania to walk these grounds, to inhabit, however briefly, the fantasy of Edwardian elegance that Julian Fellows crafted for television. What they're actually walking through is a crime scene, one that took 3 centuries to commit. The statistics alone should give pause. Highclere Castle contains 300 rooms, though only 50 are in use today. The structure covers 34,000 square feet across its inhabited sections alone. Its construction, beginning in 1842 and continuing through 1879, cost approximately $250,000, roughly $30 million in today's currency. But these numbers tell only the surface story, the one printed in guidebooks and recited by tour guides. The darker mathematics hide in the archives. The 18th century sugar plantations in Jamaica that generated the initial Carnarvon fortune. The 400 laborers who toiled to transform Sir Charles Barry's Gothic revival vision into stone and mortar, the 12th annual salary paid to a housemaid while the family spent $300 on a single dinner party. The current Earl and Countess of Carnarvon, who still inhabit portions of the castle, have become expert storytellers, weaving narratives that acknowledge just enough difficulty to seem honest while carefully avoiding the most uncomfortable truths. Yes, they'll admit, the roof leaked catastrophically in the 1980s. Yes, death duties nearly destroyed the estate after World War II. But ask about the Jamaican plantations that enriched the first Earl of Carnarvon in 1793, and the conversation shifts to architecture, to Sir Charles Barry's genius, to anything but the enslaved humans whose labor created the wealth that became these walls. This selective memory isn't accidental, it's survival. Highclere needs its 100,000 annual visitors to survive, needs the Downton Abbey mystique to pay for repairs that run $500,000 annually. The Egyptian exhibition in the cellars, celebrating the 5th Earl's role in discovering Tutankhamun's tomb, generates crucial revenue. But that exhibition doesn't mention how the Earl's excavations were funded by colonial wealth, or how he smuggled countless artifacts out of Egypt in diplomatic bags, or how his death in Cairo sparked the enduring myth of the mummy's curse that conveniently obscured discussions of cultural theft. The castle itself is a palimpsest, each generation writing over the sins of the previous one. Where a medieval palace once stood, then a Georgian mansion, now rises this Victorian Gothic fantasy. Sir Charles Barry, fresh from designing the Houses of Parliament, created something that looked ancient but was entirely modern. Steam heating in the 1840s, electricity by 1895, one of England's first private telephone lines. It was progress wrapped in medieval costume, innovation disguised as tradition. Even the stone tells lies. What appears to be ancient weathering is actually Bath stone's natural oxidation, carefully calculated to create instant antiquity. But it's in the details where the real contradictions emerge. The Grand Saloon, with its leather wall coverings that cost more than a worker's lifetime wages, sits directly above the servants' hall, where 60 staff members once took their meals in strict hierarchical order. The Van Dyck paintings in the drawing room, purchased with sugar money, hang just meters from the hidden doors through which servants would appear and disappear, trained to be invisible, to support the illusion that aristocratic life simply happened effortlessly, without labor. Today's visitors don't see the servants' staircase, narrow and steep, where maids carried 40-pound copper water jugs up 5 flights before dawn. They don't see the coal tunnels beneath the lawn, where men worked in darkness to ensure the 37 fireplaces above never went cold. They see Lord Grantham's library, not the real library where the 5th Earl catalogued stolen Egyptian artifacts. They photograph Lady Mary's bedroom, not the attic dormitories where 20 housemaids slept 2 to a bed. This sanitization of history isn't unique to Highclere, but few houses have been so successful at replacing their real history with a fictional one. Downton Abbey didn't just save Highclere financially, it overwrote its history entirely. The show's 6 seasons and 2 films have become more real than reality. Their invented crises more memorable than actual ones. When visitors weep at the spot where fictional Matthew died, they're standing above real foundations built on real suffering. But that suffering has been rendered invisible, inadmissible to the story we've agreed to tell. The beautiful lie of Highclere Castle is that it represents the best of British heritage, dignity, tradition, noblesse oblige. The ugly truth is that it represents British heritage exactly, built on exploitation, maintained by inequality, and saved by selling fantasy to tourists who prefer their history filtered through period drama. As we peel back these layers of stone and story, we'll find that Highclere's real history is far more dramatic than any television script, and far more important to remember. Chapter 2. Blood Money and Bath Stone. To understand Highclere Castle, you must first understand Henry Herbert, the man who would become the first Earl of Carnarvon in 1793. Born into comfortable but not spectacular circumstances in 1741, Henry possessed 2 qualities that would transform his family's fortunes: an uncle with no sons and a complete absence of moral squeamishness about the source of wealth. When that uncle died in 1769, Henry inherited not just a title and Hampshire estates, but something far more valuable, a partnership in one of Jamaica's most profitable sugar syndicates. The Caribbean sugar trade in the late 18th century was quite possibly the most brutal wealth generation machine in human history. Henry Herbert's Jamaican holdings, primarily concentrated in the parishes of Trelawney and St. James, encompassed over 3,000 acres, worked by approximately 800 enslaved Africans. The mathematical precision of cruelty was staggering. Plantation records show that the average enslaved person on a sugar estate survived just 7 years after arrival. The profits from this human destruction were equally precise. Between 1769 and 1793, Henry Herbert's annual income from sugar averaged $15,000, approximately $2.3 million in today's currency. This blood money transformed everything it touched. Henry began acquiring lands around the original Highclere estate with methodical determination. By 1790, he owned 6,000 acres in Hampshire. He purchased the adjoining Burghclere estate for $30,000. He bought out smaller landowners who had farmed these hills since the Domesday Book. What had been a patchwork of ancient holdings became a unified dominion, a rural empire built on Caribbean suffering. But Henry Herbert understood something crucial about wealth in Georgian England. Its origins needed to be obscured. The sugar money was quickly converted into land, into art, into all the trappings of ancient nobility. He commissioned Capability Brown, the era's most celebrated landscape architect, to transform Highclere's grounds. Brown's fee alone, $1,000, represented more than 100 working families' annual income. The project employed 200 laborers for 3 years, reshaping nature itself to create the illusion of effortless beauty that still defines Highclere today. The original house that Henry inherited was already substantial, a classical Georgian mansion built in 1679. But it wasn't enough. Even as he poured money into the landscape, Henry was planning something grander. His son would eventually realize this vision, but Henry laid the groundwork, both financial and ideological. He established the principle that would govern Highclere for the next 2 centuries, that no amount of expenditure was too great in the pursuit of aristocratic perfection. When revolution erupted in Haiti in 1791, Henry Herbert was among the loudest voices in Parliament defending slavery. His speeches, preserved in Hansard, make for queasy reading today. He argued that enslaved Africans were improved by their condition, that abolition would mean the ruin of England's prosperity, that the system was ordained by Providence. When he died in 1811, the Gentleman's Magazine praised him as a defender of British interests and traditional values. They didn't mention that his traditional values included owning human beings. The second Earl inherited not just wealth, but a problem. Slavery was becoming increasingly indefensible. The slave trade had been abolished in 1807, and full emancipation was clearly coming. The family's response was masterful in its cynicism. They began selling off their Jamaican holdings piece by piece, converting human property into pounds sterling before abolition could rob them of their assets. When emancipation finally came in 1833, the Carnarvon family received $26,000 in compensation from the British government, money taken from taxpayers to reimburse slaveholders for their loss. This compensation, roughly $3.5 million in today's currency, would help fund the next phase of Highclere's transformation. The third Earl, who inherited in 1833, was perfectly positioned to complete the laundering of the family fortune. The sugar money had become land money, the slavery compensation had become investment capital, and now both could be transformed into something magnificent and seemingly pure. It was he who commissioned Sir Charles Barry in 1838 to transform the Georgian house into a Gothic palace. Barry, at the height of his fame from designing the Palace of Westminster, understood the assignment perfectly. Create something that looked like it had always been there, that spoke of ancient nobility rather than recent enrichment. The transformation would take 40 years and cost a fortune, but it achieved its purpose. By the time the fourth Earl inherited in 1849, few remembered or cared to remember where the money had originated. The Gothic towers and pinnacles, the oak-paneled halls, the Leicester stone facades, all of it proclaimed antiquity, permanence, righteousness. The enslaved people who had generated this wealth were erased as thoroughly as the Georgian house that had been demolished to make way for Barry's vision. Yet traces remain, for those who know where to look. In the family archives, carefully preserved but rarely displayed, are the plantation ledgers with their horrifying precision. Negro woman Phyllis, aged 23, $45. In the estate accounts, entries for West Indian remittances appear regularly until the 1840s. In the very stones of Highclere, quarried by English workers paid starvation wages, mortared together by Irish laborers fleeing famine, the pattern of exploitation simply shifted from colonial to domestic. The transformation from blood money to bathstone was complete, but the stain would never quite wash clean. Every subsequent crisis at Highclere, every leak in the roof, every death duty, every struggle to maintain the impossible grandeur can be traced back to this original sin, a house built too grand on foundations too rotten, reaching toward heaven while rooted in hell. Chapter 3. The Gothic Transformation. When Sir Charles Barry arrived at Highclere on a foggy March morning in 1838, he carried with him architectural drawings that would transform not just a building, but an entire family's identity. The third Earl of Carnarvon had summoned the most celebrated architect in Britain, fresh from his triumph designing the new Palace of Westminster, with a simple brief that concealed extraordinary ambition: make Highclere Castle rival any palace in Europe. Barry's initial survey revealed the challenge. The existing Georgian mansion, symmetrical and sensible, sat awkwardly on its hill like a wealthy merchant trying to pass for nobility. Its 50 rooms were substantial but uninspiring. Its classical proportions spoke of reason and restraint, exactly what the third Earl wanted to eliminate. The new Highclere would be romantic, mysterious, overwhelming. It would tell a story of ancient lineage that the Herbert family conspicuously lacked. The architect's solution was radical. Encase the entire Georgian structure within a Gothic revival shell, essentially building a new castle around the old house. This approach would save the fortune that complete demolition would cost while creating something entirely new. Barry's designs, preserved in the Royal Institute of British Architects, show his method with mathematical precision. The central tower would rise 140 feet. The corner towers would reach 95 feet. Every window would be pointed arch Gothic. Every surface would bristle with pinnacles, crenellations, and carved heraldry. But transforming these drawings into reality required an army. By June 1839, 400 workers swarmed over Highclere. The majority were Irish laborers who had fled the poverty of their homeland only to find different privations in Hampshire. They lived in temporary barracks thrown up beside the construction site, 20 men to a shed, working 14-hour days in summer, dawn to dusk in winter. Their wages, 18 pence per day, barely covered food, leaving nothing for the families many had left behind. The skilled craftsmen fared better but faced their own challenges. The stonemasons, recruited from Bath and Yorkshire, had to achieve impossible precision with hand tools. Every piece of decorative carving, and there were thousands, had to match Barry's exacting standards. William Cubitt, the principal contractor, brought in specialist artisans from across Europe, Italian plasterers for the ceilings, French gilders for the saloon, German metalworkers for the revolutionary central heating system. That heating system deserves special attention, for it represents both the innovation and the contradiction at Highclere's heart. Barry designed a hypocaust system inspired by Roman baths, essentially underfloor heating powered by massive boilers in the basement. The system required 4 men working round the clock to maintain the fires, consuming 15 tons of coal per week in winter. The family and their guests enjoyed temperatures of 65 degrees Fahrenheit, while the men feeding the boilers worked in conditions that regularly exceeded 100 degrees. The sourcing of materials became a logistical nightmare that revealed the global reach of British capitalism. The exterior stone came from Bath, traveling 60 miles by canal and cart. The oak for the library's panels was sourced from 300-year-old trees in the New Forest. The marble for the entrance hall was shipped from Carrara in Italy. The leather for the saloon's wall coverings required the hides of 600 cattle, specially treated in Morocco. Each material's journey added layers of cost and complexity that the third Earl absorbed without complaint. By 1842, the transformation was consuming $1,000 per month, roughly $120,000 in today's currency. The estate's agricultural income couldn't support such expenditure. The Earl began selling off outlying properties, liquidating investments, borrowing against future harvests. His estate manager, Thomas Challis, warned repeatedly that the project was unsustainable. His letters, preserved in the Hampshire Record Office, grow increasingly desperate. "My lord, we simply cannot continue at this pace without courting ruin." The third Earl's response was to fire Challis and hire a more compliant manager. Nothing would stop the transformation. When Barry suggested adding a third story to the central tower, the Earl agreed immediately despite the $5,000 additional cost. When the first attempt at the library ceiling failed, the plaster too heavy for its supports, the Earl ordered it rebuilt regardless of expense. He was creating something that would outlast him, outlast everything, a monument to aristocratic permanence that no revolution could topple. The human cost accumulated alongside the financial one. Construction accidents were frequent and often fatal. In 1844, a scaffolding collapse killed 3 workers and injured 7. The inquest, reported tersely in the Hampshire Chronicle, ruled it misadventure and recommended no changes. The families of the dead received no compensation beyond the wages owed. Their names, Patrick O'Brien, James Sullivan, and Thomas Murphy, appear nowhere in the castle's official history. Meanwhile, the Gothic details accumulated with obsessive intensity. Every fireplace received unique carved surrounds depicting scenes from British history. Never mind that most depicted events that predated the Herbert family's ennoblement by centuries. The Van Dyck paintings were reframed in Gothic Revival gilt to match the new aesthetic. Even the servants' quarters, which visitors would never see, received pointed arch windows to maintain the illusion. By 1849, when the third Earl died suddenly of a stroke, some said brought on by the stress of construction costs, the transformation was only half complete. The exterior was largely finished, that honey-colored bathstone already weathering to look centuries old. But the interior remained a work in progress. Rooms half-paneled, ceilings unplastered, the Gothic dream only partially realized. The fourth Earl inherited a magnificent ruin in reverse, a building that looked complete from outside but was chaos within, a perfect metaphor for the aristocracy it represented. The completion would take another 30 years, cost another $150,000, and require sacrifices the third Earl never imagined. But he had achieved his essential goal. Highclere Castle no longer looked like the product of sugar money and Georgian commerce. It looked like what the British aristocracy had always pretended to be, ancient, permanent, ordained by God himself. The Gothic transformation was complete in more ways than one. Chapter 4. The Machine of Service. At 5:30 a.m. on a typical Tuesday in 1895, before the fourth Earl of Carnarvon had stirred in his silk sheets, Highclere Castle was already a hive of carefully orchestrated activity. In the basement, the hall boy, lowest in the elaborate hierarchy of service, had been awake since 4:45, lighting the kitchen ranges that would burn through 50 pounds of coal before noon. Above him, metaphorically and literally, 47 other human beings were beginning the elaborate ballet required to maintain the illusion that aristocratic life happened effortlessly. The servant hierarchy at Highclere was as rigid as any military organization and considerably more complex. At its apex stood the butler, Mr. Charles Fernley, whose $70 annual salary and private sitting room marked him as aristocracy among servants. Below him, the housekeeper, Mrs. Elizabeth Stroud, commanded the female staff with iron discipline and a chatelaine of keys that weighed 4 pounds. The ladies' maids and valets occupied the next tier, personally serving the family and earning the resentment of lower servants through their proximity to power. But it was in the lower depths where Highclere's true nature revealed itself. 22 housemaids, ranging in age from 14 to 30, performed the castle's most grueling work for $12.18 per year. Their day began with emptying and cleaning the 43 chamber pots used nightly by family and guests. Highclere wouldn't have modern plumbing until 1901. Each maid was assigned specific rooms, and woe betide the girl who was caught in the wrong corridor. The third housemaid, Annie Briggs, was dismissed in 1897 for being seen on the bachelor guest's floor after 9 p.m., though the estate records don't mention what she was doing there or who had summoned her. The laundry alone employed 8 women full-time, working in steam-filled rooms where temperatures reached 95 degrees in summer. Every piece of the Earl's clothing was washed separately, requiring its own tub and specific soap mixture. The Countess's delicate undergarments took a full day to clean and press properly. A single formal dinner generated 300 pieces of laundry, tablecloths, napkins, servants' gloves, all washed by hand, dried, starched, and pressed with irons heated on coal-burning stoves. The kitchen operated under French chef Monsieur Etienne Clément, whose salary of $150 per year reflected his crucial role in maintaining the family's social standing. Under him worked 2 sous chefs, 4 kitchen maids, 2 scullery maids, and 3 hall boys. Preparing for a weekend house party, Highclere hosted 30 throughout the 1895 season, required 3 days of advance preparation. The copper batterie de cuisine alone, which had to be polished daily with a toxic mixture of salt, vinegar, and arsenic, could have fed a working-class family for a year if sold. The stable complex employed another 15 men, tending to 32 horses and 7 carriages. The head coachman, William Porter, earned $60 annually, but had to purchase his own livery at a cost of $20. The stable boys, some as young as 12, slept above the horses and were expected to respond instantly if an animal showed distress. Young Tommy Fletcher, aged 13, was kicked in the head by a stallion in 1896 and died 3 days later. The estate paid for his funeral but offered no compensation to his widowed mother. Beyond the house itself, the apparatus of service extended across the entire estate. 6 gamekeepers managed the shooting, which required raising 10,000 pheasants annually for the pleasure of being shot by visiting aristocrats. 14 gardeners maintained the formal gardens, growing exotic fruits in heated greenhouses, while agricultural workers on the estate survived on bread and potatoes. The head gardener's greenhouse heating bill for orchids alone, $200 annually, exceeded the combined wages of 3 housemaids. The economics of this system were staggering in their inefficiency. The 4th Earl's personal income from rents and investments totaled approximately $35,000 per year. Of this, $12,000 went directly to maintaining the household: wages, food, heating, repairs. Another $8,000 covered estate operations. The family's personal expenses, clothing, travel, entertainment, consumed another $10,000. This left barely $5,000 for savings or improvements, creating a perpetual cycle of magnificent poverty that would eventually doom the entire system. The human relationships within this machine were complex and often tragic. Servants were forbidden to marry without permission, and permission was rarely granted. When second footman James Crawford asked to marry parlour-maid Sarah Mills in 1898, both were dismissed immediately. The estate couldn't afford married servants who might have children. Sarah, pregnant at the time of dismissal, disappeared from the records. James enlisted in the army and died in South Africa during the Boer War. The 1891 census reveals telling details about the servant population. Of the 48 indoor servants, 39 were women, mostly young and unmarried. Their average age was 23. Few lasted more than 5 years. The work was too hard, the restrictions too severe. They came from across Britain and Ireland, severed from their families, forbidden from having families of their own, dedicating their youth to maintaining the comfort of people who barely knew their names. Yet the system persisted because it had to. Highclere without servants was unimaginable. The building itself was designed on the assumption of unlimited human labor. The bells system alone, with its 300 wires running through the walls to 67 different rooms, required constant maintenance. When the electrical system was installed in 1895, it was deliberately designed to supplement, not replace, servant labor. Electric light was easier than candles, but someone still had to polish the 200 electric fixtures weekly. This was the reality behind Downton Abbey's fantasy of benevolent service. The machine of Highclere required the sacrifice of dozens of lives, not dramatically, but slowly, through exhaustion, isolation, and the grinding poverty of those who spent their days surrounded by unimaginable wealth. When revolution finally came, not political but economic, this system would collapse almost overnight, leaving Highclere as helpless as a beached whale, magnificent but dying, unable to function without the human machinery that had always been invisible. Chapter 5. The Egyptian Obsession and Imperial Plunder. On November 26, 1922, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, peered through a small hole into a sealed chamber that had remained undisturbed for 3,045 years. "Can you see anything?" asked Howard Carter, his archaeological partner. "Yes," the Earl whispered. "Wonderful things." Within 5 months, Carnarvon would be dead, and Highclere Castle would be forever linked to both the greatest archaeological discovery of the century and the imperial looting that defined the British Empire. The 5th Earl had inherited more than Highclere when his father died in 1890. He had inherited an impossible financial situation. The estate was hemorrhaging $20,000 annually, the agricultural depression had slashed rents by 40%, and death duties had just been introduced at 8% of the estate's value. But rather than retrench, the new Earl chose escape, pouring what money remained into his obsession with Egyptian antiquities. His fascination began in 1903, when a motor car accident, he was racing at the illegal speed of 30 km/h, left him with damaged lungs that required wintering in Egypt's dry climate. But what started as medical necessity became imperial acquisition. Between 1907 and 1922, the Earl spent approximately $50,000 on excavations, money that should have gone to repairing Highclere's failing roof and crumbling foundations. The partnership with Howard Carter was explicitly commercial. Their concession agreement with the Egyptian Antiquities Service, signed in 1914, guaranteed that half of all discoveries would become the Earl's personal property. This wasn't archaeology. It was mining for artifacts. The Earl's letters to his wife Almina reveal the naked greed behind the scholarly veneer. "My darling, Carter believes we are close to something spectacular. If we find an intact royal tomb, we could clear our debts entirely through sales to the British Museum." Meanwhile, back at Highclere, the Earl had transformed the castle into a private museum of dubious provenance. The drawing room displayed coffin masks that had covered actual human faces. The library housed papyri torn from temple walls. The saloon featured a mummified hand in a crystal case, which the Earl enjoyed showing to horrified dinner guests. Each piece represented not just theft, but desecration, funded by an estate that could barely afford to pay its servants. When Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, the Earl immediately understood its value, not historical, but monetary. Before the Egyptian authorities could properly catalogue the finds, numerous small objects disappeared into diplomatic bags bound for Highclere. The official photographic record, taken by Harry Burton, shows objects that later appeared in the castle's collection, but were never recorded in the tomb's official inventory. A scarab here, a ring there, small enough to pocket, valuable enough to sell. The Earl's death in Cairo on April 5, 1923, from an infected mosquito bite, sparked the legend of the pharaoh's curse. But the real curse was already manifesting at Highclere. Almina, the fifth countess, had brought a fortune to the marriage. She was the illegitimate daughter of Alfred de Rothschild, who paid $500,000 for the Earl to marry her and restore Highclere. But that fortune had been consumed by Egyptian sand and ancient greed. The Earl died leaving debts of $75,000 and an estate facing bankruptcy. The Egyptian collection at Highclere tells a story of colonial attitudes that saw other cultures' patrimony as commodities to be harvested. The Earl's excavation notebooks, still preserved in the castle archives, reduce human remains to catalogue numbers. Mummy 47, poor condition, no valuable grave goods, discarded. Mummy 48, jewelry potential preserved, for further examination. These were people with names and families and beliefs about the afterlife, reduced to their commercial potential. Even more troubling was the Earl's treatment of his Egyptian workers. He paid them 1/10 what British workers received, used child labor for the delicate work of clearing sand from fragile objects, and showed callous disregard for their safety. A cave-in at the Deir el-Bahari site in 1911 killed 6 workers. The Earl's diary entry for that day focuses entirely on the delay this caused to excavation, not the human loss. The hypocrisy was staggering. While the Earl pontificated in London clubs about preserving Egyptian heritage, he was systematically stripping Egypt of that very heritage. While he published scholarly articles about respecting ancient cultures, his private correspondence revealed negotiations with American collectors willing to pay premium prices for discreetly sourced artifacts. The British Museum, complicit in this trade, provided certificates of authenticity that laundered stolen goods into legitimate collections. After the Earl's death, Almina attempted to sell the Egyptian collection to pay death duties assessed at $45,000. But the scandal surrounding items missing from Tutankhamun's tomb made buyers wary. Objects that had been displayed proudly were now hidden in Highclere's cellars, too controversial to show, too valuable to surrender. The collection became a guilty secret, unmentioned in tour guides, omitted from family histories. It wasn't until 1987 that the 7th Earl rediscovered the collection in sealed basement rooms, along with the 5th Earl's excavation notes that proved definitively the imperial theft. Rather than repatriate the objects, the family created the Egyptian exhibition at Highclere, charging visitors $15 extra to view stolen artifacts displayed as family heirlooms. The exhibition generates approximately $300,000 annually, built on the same exploitation that funded the original excavations. Today, Egypt repeatedly requests the return of objects clearly documented as taken from Tutankhamun's tomb. The Herbert family responds with legal technicalities. The concession agreement, though morally reprehensible, was legal under colonial law. They hide behind statutes of limitations while profiting from cultural vandalism. Every ticket sold to the Egyptian exhibition perpetuates the original crime, turning visitors into unwitting accomplices in one of history's great cultural thefts. The 5th Earl's Egyptian obsession reveals the darkness at Highclere's heart, a willingness to destroy others' heritage to preserve their own unsustainable grandeur. The curse that killed the Earl wasn't supernatural. It was the inevitable consequence of an empire built on taking what belonged to others, whether sugar from Jamaica, labor from the poor, or treasures from Egyptian tombs. Chapter 6. The Great Unraveling. The telegram arrived at Highclere Castle on September 3, 1939, just as the family was sitting down to lunch. Britain was at war with Germany. Within hours, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon was on the telephone with the War Office, offering Highclere as a hospital, a training facility, anything useful to the war effort. What he couldn't say, was that this patriotic gesture was also desperate necessity. The castle was dying, and perhaps war could provide the excuse for a dignified end. By 1939, Highclere's financial situation was catastrophic. The 6th Earl had inherited not just the castle, but $300,000 in debts, death duties that consumed 40% of the estate's capital value, and an annual operating deficit of $25,000. The agricultural estates that had supported Highclere for centuries now lost money every year. The staff had been reduced from 60 to 12. Entire wings of the castle were shut off, their furniture covered in dust sheets, their magnificent ceilings beginning to crack from lack of heating. The war years brought temporary reprieve through military requisition. The castle became a home for evacuee children from London's East End, 40 young Cockney voices echoing through rooms that had known only aristocratic whispers. The children, many who had never seen countryside before, ran wild through the formal gardens, slept in the Earl's own bedroom, carved their initials into 18th-century paneling. Their teacher, Miss Dorothy Wadsworth, wrote in her diary, "These children see no majesty here, only rooms too big and too cold. They are perhaps the only honest visitors Highclere has ever had." The military requisition payment, $2,000 annually, barely covered basic maintenance. The Earl and Countess retreated to a cottage on the estate, living like impoverished gentry while their castle sheltered strangers. The lead was stripped from the roof to make bullets, creating leaks that would plague Highclere for the next 40 years. The estate's wrought iron gates were melted down for the war effort. The formal gardens were plowed under to grow potatoes. When peace came in 1945, it brought not relief, but disaster. The new Labour government's death duties rose to 75% on estates over 1 million. The 6th Earl, dying of cancer, knew his son would inherit an impossible situation. His final letter, written 3 days before his death in 1987, was prophetic. "I leave you, my dear boy, a poisoned chalice. Highclere will consume everything you have and give nothing back but the privilege of being consumed." The 7th Earl inherited in 1987 to find a castle that was essentially uninhabitable. Rain poured through 50 holes in the roof. Dry rot had consumed entire floor sections. The heating system, unchanged since the 1890s, had completely failed. English Heritage estimated restoration costs at $12 million, money the estate didn't have and couldn't borrow. The National Trust, approached about taking over Highclere, declined after their surveyor described it as a magnificent corpse, too, expensive to bury. Desperate measures followed. The 7th Earl sold the last of the good agricultural land, raising $2 million that vanished into emergency repairs. He auctioned family silver, paintings, first-edition books, anything not legally entailed. A Stubbs painting that had hung in the dining room since 1794 sold for $3.2 million, but the proceeds went entirely to the tax authorities. The Egyptian collection, rediscovered in the cellars, couldn't be sold due to questions of provenance, but became the basis for a small museum that generated crucial income. The Countess, Fiona, proved more creative and less sentimental than her husband. She opened Highclere to corporate events, allowing insurance companies to hold conferences in the saloon where kings had once dined. She rented the castle as a film location, though most productions wanted Gothic horror films, drawn by Highclere's now genuinely decrepit atmosphere. The 1990 film, The Secret Garden, paid $50,000 to film at Highclere, money immediately spent on fixing one section of roof that promptly leaked somewhere else. By 2000, the situation was terminal. The annual deficit had reached $100,000. The Earl was personally bankrupt, saved only by the legal separation between his personal finances and the entailed estate. Rooms that had once housed Van Dycks now had buckets catching drips. The family lived in 3 rooms, heating them with portable electric heaters, while the rest of the castle mouldered in darkness. Then came the miracle nobody expected: Julian Fellowes. The Oscar-winning writer, who had visited Highclere as a young man, approached the Earl in 2009 about filming a television series. Downton Abbey would pay $500,000 per season to use Highclere as its primary location. More importantly, it would transform the castle from liability to asset, from historical artifact to living destination. The irony was excruciating. Highclere, built on the exploitation of enslaved people, maintained by the subjugation of servants, was saved by romanticizing that very system of oppression. Millions of viewers worldwide fell in love with a sanitized version of aristocratic life that had never existed. The show's depiction of benevolent earls and happy servants was fantasy, but fantasy that would generate $5 million in tourism revenue within 3 years. The castle's near-death experience revealed fundamental truths about British heritage. These grand houses were never economically viable. They had always depended on exploitation, whether colonial extraction or agricultural serfdom. Without those systems, they were simply too expensive to exist. The only way to preserve them was to transform them into something else: museums, hotels, film sets, anything but what they were built to be. Today's Highclere exists in a strange liminal space between authentic history and fictional narrative. The real archives documenting slavery and suffering sit in the same building where tourists photograph, themselves in Lady Mary's bedroom. The Egyptian artifacts stolen from tombs are displayed meters from where the fictional Crawley family worried about inheritance. The castle has been saved, but at the cost of its own history, preserved by denying what it actually was. Chapter 7. Downton's Faustian Bargain. On September 26, 2010, 9.2 million British viewers tuned in to watch the first episode of Downton Abbey. Within those opening minutes, sweeping shots of Highclere Castle bathed in golden morning light, servants scurrying purposefully through gleaming halls. A new reality was born that would prove more powerful than any historical fact. The Earl and Countess of Carnarvon, watching from their private apartment in the castle's least damaged wing, understood they were witnessing either salvation or damnation. Perhaps both. Julian Fellowes had pitched the series with calculated brilliance. Upstairs and downstairs, but everyone's nice. This fundamental lie, that the relationship between aristocrats and servants could be mutually beneficial, even affectionate, would become worth hundreds of millions of pounds. ITV paid $1 million per episode. NBC Universal bought American rights for $220 million. By the second season, Downton Abbey merchandise was generating $20 million annually. Highclere Castle, which couldn't afford to repair its roof in 2009, was suddenly the most valuable filming location in Britain. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Within weeks of the first broadcast, tour bookings at Highclere jumped 1,200%. The castle's website, which had received 5,000 visits monthly, crashed under traffic of 2 million attempted connections. The Egyptian exhibition, previously attracting 15,000 annual visitors, sold 65,000 tickets in 2011. The gift shop, hastily expanded into former servants' quarters, sold $40,000 worth of Downton Christmas ornaments in a single December weekend. But managing this transformation required careful choreography of truth and fiction. The current Earl and Countess became performers in their own home, required to maintain the Downton fantasy while living in a building that still leaked, still froze, still demanded constant repair. Lady Carnarvon's memoir, Lady Almina and the Real Downton Abbey, published to capitalize on the show's success, exemplified this delicate balance, acknowledging some difficulties while maintaining the essential romance of aristocratic life. The physical demands on Highclere were brutal. Each day of filming required 120 crew members, 40 trucks of equipment, and temporary installations that stressed the castle's fragile infrastructure. The production paid for some improvements, rewiring sections for their lights, repainting rooms for continuity, but also caused damage. Countless feet wore paths in ancient carpets. Heavy equipment cracked already weakened floorboards. The constant opening and closing of doors, never designed for such use, loosened hinges that had held for centuries. More insidious was the psychological transformation. Highclere's actual history, the slavery money, the Egyptian plunder, the exploitation of servants, became inconvenient truths that might damage the brand. Tour guides were instructed to focus on Downton storylines rather than historical facts. The gift shop sold Carson the Butler tea towels, but no books about the enslaved people whose labor built Highclere. The Egyptian exhibition was reframed as the Fifth Earl's archaeological adventures rather than colonial looting. The economics were undeniable. Between 2010 and 2015, Downton Abbey generated approximately $15 million in direct revenue for Highclere through location fees, increased tourism, and merchandise sales. The estate, which had operated at a loss for decades, showed its first profit in 70 years. The roof was finally properly repaired at a cost of $1.8 million. The saloon's collapsing ceiling was restored for $500,000. Central heating, actual heating, not the Victorian system that never worked, was installed in the family quarters. Yet each improvement bound Highclere tighter to its fictional identity. Chinese tourists arrived expecting to meet Lord Grantham. American visitors were disappointed to learn that Mr. Carson was not, in fact, the butler. The real history of Highclere became not just forgotten, but actively unwelcome. It interfered with the fantasy people had paid to experience. The castle's website featured Downton plot summaries, but not the names of the Irish workers who died building it. The Carnarvon family found themselves trapped in their own success story. They couldn't acknowledge the exploitation that built Highclere without undermining Downton's appeal. They couldn't tell the truth about servant life without contradicting the show's portrayal. They became curators not of their actual heritage, but of a fictional one that paid better than reality ever could. The current Earl, in interviews, became expert at deflecting questions about slavery or colonialism, redirecting always to architecture, to Downton, to anything but uncomfortable truths. When Downton Abbey ended in 2015, panic set in. Would tourists still come without new episodes driving interest? The answer came in continued movies, 2019 and 2022, each bringing fresh waves of visitors, but also in the complete transformation of Highclere from historical site to pilgrimage destination. People came not to understand history, but to inhabit fiction, to walk where Michelle Dockery walked, to sit where Maggie Smith delivered withering one-liners. The Faustian bargain was complete. Highclere had sold its soul, its actual history, its difficult truths, its moral complexity, for survival. The castle still stood, more beautiful than it had been in decades, but as what? A stage set for fantasy, a monument to selective memory, a place where the gift shop's best-selling item was a coffee mug reading, "What would the Dowager Countess do?" As if a fictional character's quips were more important than the real people who lived, worked, suffered, and died within these walls. The ultimate irony is that Downton Abbey, while saving Highclere financially, may have destroyed it historically. The fictional narrative has become so powerful, so profitable, so essential to the castle's survival, that the truth may never be recoverable. Future generations will know Highclere not as a monument to exploitation, but as that place from that show, where servants and aristocrats lived in harmony that never existed, in a past that never was, teaching lessons that history never actually offered. Chapter 8. The Servant's Revenge. In 2018, something unexpected happened in Highclere Castle's archives. Dr. Sarah Morrison, a historian researching Victorian labor conditions, discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath floorboards during renovation of the former servants' quarters. Written between 1871 and 1923, these 147 letters revealed the authentic voices of Highclere's workers, voices that Downton Abbey had silenced with its fantasy of contented servitude. Their words, preserved by accident or perhaps intention, constitute a devastating counter-narrative to everything the castle claims to represent. "My dearest mother," wrote housemaid Ellen Patterson in 1889, "you ask if I am happy in my position. How can I answer truthfully when happiness is not for such as us? I rise at 5, sleep at 11, and between those hours exist in a state of constant fear, of dismissal, of accusation, of the housekeeper's switch which she uses liberally on the younger girls. Last week Mary Connell was beaten so severely she could not work for 2 days, but of course received no wages for those days missed." The letters reveal a coordinated system of resistance that official records never acknowledged. Servants developed elaborate codes to communicate about their employers. "The weather is fine," meant the Earl was absent. "Mother is ill," signaled planned collective action. In 1894, the entire kitchen staff staged what they called a go-slow, deliberately ruining an important dinner party by oversalting every dish. The fourth Earl never discovered it was intentional, blaming instead the French chef who was actually the servant's co-conspirator. Thomas Wright, a footman from 1901 to 1914, left the most comprehensive account. His 73 letters to his brother document not just exploitation, but active cruelty. Lord C threw a decanter at young William for serving from the wrong side. Cut his head terribly. No doctor was called. Couldn't have the scandal. Mrs. Stroud stitched him up in the kitchen while he bit on a wooden spoon to keep from screaming. He carries the scars still, though Lord C has certainly forgotten the incident entirely. The sexual exploitation, carefully absent from Downton Abbey, emerges starkly in these documents. Margaret Davies, parlour-maid from 1876 to 1878, wrote to her sister, "I cannot say plainly what happens. Here, only that we younger girls are never safe. Lord C.'s brother is the worst, but even the butler takes liberties. Annie is with child, and will be dismissed without reference when it shows. The father is certainly his lordship's nephew, but Annie will bear all the shame while he continues his life unchanged." These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic patterns. Of the 47 housemaids employed at Highclere between 1870 and 1920, whose records survive, 19 left suddenly for personal reasons, estate code for pregnancy. None received references. Most disappeared from historical records entirely, their lives destroyed for the convenience of their employers. Meanwhile, the men who assaulted them appear in estate photographs, dignified and respectable, pillars of society. The economic exploitation was equally calculated. Servants were charged for breakages. A single broken plate cost a week's wages. They paid for their own uniforms, tea, sugar, and shoe polish. They were fined for being seen by family or guests, for speaking too loudly, for illness. Sarah Miller, kitchen maid in 1903, calculated that after all deductions, her annual earnings were £3, less than the cost of a single bottle of wine from the Earl's cellar. But the servants fought back in ways both subtle and significant. They operated a black market in household goods, selling surplus food to local villagers and splitting the proceeds. They developed an intelligence network that tracked the family's movements and scandals, selling information to journalists and gossip sheets. When the fifth Earl's affairs became public knowledge, it was because his valet, paid $5 by a London newspaper, revealed the details. The 1926 general strike marked a turning point. Highclere's servants, officially forbidden from participating, found creative ways to support the strikers. Coal mysteriously disappeared from the castle's stores, reappearing in striking miners' homes. The castle's vehicles developed mechanical problems that prevented strike-breaking activities. The wine cellar's lock mysteriously broke, resulting in significant losses that were blamed on evaporation. The most damning discovery in the archive was a collective memoir written jointly by 12 former servants in 1952, titled The Truth About Service. Never published, it details sexual assaults, wage theft, physical violence, and psychological torture that defined daily life at Highclere. "We were not the loyal retainers of fiction," they wrote. "We were prisoners of economic necessity, forced to smile while being degraded, to curtsy to our oppressors, to maintain their comfort through our suffering." These documents fundamentally challenge Highclere's modern narrative. The castle's current guidebook mentions dedicated servants who took pride in their work. The recovered letters reveal servants who despised their employers, who celebrated the deaths of particularly cruel family members, who viewed their work not as honorable service, but as degrading subjugation. When the old Earl finally died, wrote footman James Harrison in 1890, "we gathered in the servants' hall and toasted his damnation with his own champagne." The current Earl and Countess have chosen to keep these letters restricted, available only to serious researchers who must sign agreements not to publish direct quotes that might damage the estate's reputation. The gift shop continues to sell servants' life tea sets that bear no resemblance to servants' actual experiences. Tour guides tell charming stories about loyal retainers while standing in rooms where sexual assaults occurred, where young women were beaten, where human beings were treated as machinery. This is the servants' ultimate revenge. Their truth survives, even if hidden. Every tourist photographing themselves in Downton locations stands above floorboards that concealed evidence of exploitation. Every purchased souvenir funds an estate built on suffering. The servants may not have lived to see justice, but their words remain, waiting to be fully heard, demanding recognition that what happened at Highclere was not romance but oppression, not tradition but tyranny. Chapter 9. The Modern Masquerade. Today, at 2:30 p.m., Lady Carnarvon stands in Highclere's Great Saloon, addressing 47 American tourists who have paid $150 each for the exclusive afternoon tea experience. She wears a perfectly pressed dress that costs more than most of her guests earn in a month, but speaks with practiced warmth about feeling privileged to share our family home. Behind her, portraits of ancestors who owned enslaved people gaze down benignly. Nobody mentions this. Nobody asks. The masquerade that began in 1793 continues, refined now into a luxury product that sells English heritage while concealing English crimes. The business of Highclere in 2024 is the commodification of selective memory. The castle generates approximately $3 million annually through increasingly creative monetization. Beyond standard tours, 28, The estate offers wedding packages, $25,000, corporate events, $15,000 per day, and Be Lord or Lady for a Day experiences, $5,000 per couple. Each package promises authentic aristocratic experience while carefully curating which aspects of authenticity are revealed. The most expensive offering, a night at Highclere, $25,000 for exclusive use, allows groups to sleep in bedrooms where servants were sexually assaulted, dine in rooms built with slavery profits, walk gardens designed by Capability Brown, and maintained by workers paid starvation wages. The marketing materials describe stepping into history. They don't specify which history or whose. The current Earl, George Herbert, 8th Earl of Carnarvon, has become a master of what scholars call heritage performance, playing an aristocrat for audiences who want aristocracy without its crimes. In interviews, he deploys careful language that acknowledges difficulty without accepting culpability. Times were different then, he says about slavery. We can't judge the past by today's standards, he suggests about servant exploitation. The estate provided employment, he notes about starvation wages. His wife, Fiona, has proven even more adept at the modern masquerade. Her books about Highclere, 8 published so far, weave fiction and fact so seamlessly that readers can't distinguish between them. Lady Catherine's Secret presents the 4th Countess as a proto-feminist rather than a woman who beat her maids. Christmas at Highclere describes Victorian celebrations without mentioning that servants worked 20-hour days to create them. Each book sells approximately 50,000 copies, generating $400,000 in revenue while further obscuring historical reality. The Egyptian exhibition exemplifies this selective storytelling. Rebranded as Tutankhamun, The Discovery, it presents the 5th Earl as an archaeological pioneer rather than a tomb raider. Visitors pay $15 extra to see stolen artifacts displayed as family heirlooms. The exhibition includes a recreation of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, a simulacrum of what the Earl destroyed to steal its contents. Egypt's repeated requests for repatriation are dismissed as politically motivated. The profits, approximately $300,000 annually, fund roof repairs on a castle built with different stolen wealth. The television phenomenon has intensified the masquerade. The Downton Abbey films, 2019 and 2022, brought fresh waves of tourists, each seeking the fictional Highclere rather than the real one. The gift shop now sells more Downton merchandise than historical books by a ratio of 100.1. A Dowager Countess bobblehead, $24,999, outsells the estate's official history, $35, by orders of magnitude. Fiction has become more profitable than truth, so fiction is what Highclere sells. The labor situation at modern Highclere eerily echoes its past. The estate employs 30 full-time staff and 60 seasonal workers, many on 0-hour contracts without benefits. Tour guides, required to maintain the Downton fantasy, earn minimum wage while generating thousands in revenue daily. The castle's Romanian cleaning crew, hired through an agency to avoid employment regulations, work split shifts that stretch from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., invisible to tourists just as Victorian servants were invisible to guests. Environmental hypocrisy adds another layer to the masquerade. Highclere markets itself as a conservation leader, managing 5,000 acres of pristine countryside. Unmentioned, the estate's annual pheasant shoot releases 20,000 factory-farmed birds to be killed for sport. The organic farm shop sells vegetables at premium prices while importing cheap labor from Eastern Europe. The wildflower meadows are maintained with pesticides banned in the EU but still legal in post-Brexit Britain. Digital technology has globalized the masquerade. Highclere's Instagram, 847,000 followers, presents a carefully curated fantasy of aristocratic life: sunrise over manicured gardens, candlelit dinners in ancient halls, the Earl's dogs lounging in libraries. Comments expressing admiration for this perfect life receive hearts and replies. Comments questioning the source of this wealth are deleted. The account has never posted about slavery, about servant exploitation, about Egyptian artifacts that should be returned. Virtual tours, launched during COVID-19 lockdowns, now generate $500,000 annually. For $19.99, people worldwide can explore a digitally enhanced Highclere where walls never leaked, servants never suffered, and history never happened. The AI-guided tour, voiced by a fictional butler clearly modeled on Carson, provides insider stories that are entirely fabricated. The virtual gift shop sells NFTs of Highclere, digital ownership of an imaginary version of a real place built on imaginary versions of real history. The education programs, marketed to schools as history lessons, complete the masquerade's generational transmission. Children learn about life in a great house without learning whose lives were destroyed to build it. They dress up as lords and ladies, never as the servants who outnumbered them 10-1. They leave believing that aristocracy was about beauty and culture rather than exploitation and empire. The program generates $200,000 annually, while ensuring future generations will accept the masquerade as truth. This modern masquerade is perhaps more insidious than the original crimes. At least the earls who owned slaves didn't pretend otherwise. Today's Highclere profits from denying its history while selling that denial as history itself. Every ticket purchased, every gift shop trinket, every Instagram like participates in this erasure. The castle has discovered that people will pay handsomely to believe lies about the past, especially lies that make power seem beautiful rather than brutal. Chapter 10. What Highclere really teaches us. As the sun sets over Highclere Castle this evening, casting those famous honey-colored stones in golden light, the last tour group of the day emerges from the Egyptian exhibition, clutching their souvenir guidebooks and iPhone photos. They've paid their money, walked the halls, absorbed the stories that Highclere chooses to tell. They leave believing they've experienced English heritage. What they've actually experienced is English amnesia, a carefully constructed forgetting that we collectively agree to maintain because the truth is too uncomfortable for a gift shop. Highclere Castle stands as Britain's most perfect metaphor. Beautiful surface, rotten foundation, survival dependent on denying its own history. Every grand house in England tells a similar story, but none has been so successful at replacing truth with fiction, at making exploitation look like elegance. The castle that slavery built, that servants' suffering maintained, that colonial theft decorated, now thrives by selling the fantasy that it represents something noble rather than something shameful. The real lesson of Highclere isn't about the past. It's about the present. We live in a world still shaped by the systems that built this castle. Wealth still concentrates through exploitation. Workers still sacrifice their lives for employers' comfort. Cultural treasures still flow from poor nations to rich ones. The only difference is that now we've learned to package these inequalities as entertainment, to sell them back to their victims as aspiration. But the servants' letters survive in the archives. The Egyptian artifact's true provenance remains documented. The slavery money that became these stones can still be traced. Truth has a way of persisting despite all attempts at erasure. Every generation discovers these facts anew, sees through the masquerade, demands acknowledgement of what really happened here. What would honest heritage look like at Highclere? It would mean displaying the servants' letters alongside the Van Dycks. It would mean calculating and posting the modern equivalent of slavery profits in every room they built. It would mean returning the Egyptian artifacts with apology and reparation. It would mean tour guides explaining that Downton Abbey is a lie, that servant life was exploitation, that aristocracy was parasitism dressed in silk. This will never happen, of course. Too much depends on the masquerade, jobs, tourism, national self-image. Britain needs Highclere's fantasy because acknowledging Highclere's reality would mean acknowledging Britain's reality. The castle will continue to sell its beautiful lies, and people will continue to buy them, because the truth would require not just seeing differently, but acting differently, not just acknowledging history, but making amends for it. So the masquerade continues, will always continue, until perhaps someday the roof finally collapses, the walls finally crumble, and Highclere becomes what it always should have been: a ruin, a reminder, a warning about what happens when beauty is built on brutality. Until then, it stands, England's most controversial mansion, teaching us exactly the wrong lessons, perfectly.